My name is Pastor John Watts, or Bishop-elect John Watts. I'm the senior pastor of Kingdom Life Church Apostolic and the executive director for Young Black Scholars Institute that's in this community and also Annapolis, Maryland as well. It's truly a pleasure to see so many familiar faces and new ones in our community. I would like to first thank the leadership of Baybrook Elementary Middle School, including, thank you, Principal Carter and Mr. Williams for opening up their doors and welcoming us tonight. We are gathered here tonight to learn more about the recently released Brooklyn Homes After Action reports following the July 2nd tragic incident that deeply affected our communities. I want to extend my deepest condolences to all of those who suffered loss and trauma as a result of this heartbreaking incident. And as a community, we will move forward and heal together. Amen? So tonight we are joined by Mayor Brandon Scott, Acting Police Commissioner Worley, Housing Authority President and CEO Janet Abraham, Monzi's Associate Director of Victim Services, Mark Mason, with the hope of healing and understanding and unity. But before I give my final instructions, I must take this opportunity to mention and give special thanks to my friend, this great woman of God, our councilwoman, Felicia Porter, in her absence, Delegate Gary Simmons, Mr. Mark Mason, Mr. Richard Leandri, Miss Lanice Baylor for going above and beyond to support and provide ongoing resources through the 45 days, even unto now. I want to thank also myself, Corey Winfield with Safe Streets, Pastor Billy, Candace Golden, Miss Jean from Brooklyn Homes, the tenant council members, the residents, and along with all the organizations outside of Baltimore have already created a plan for future partnerships in this community and hope that the mayor and Monzi will help us to create capacity for us to expand our resources to the Brooklyn Homes community exponentially. But not every organization has been as consistently as they should, and we have to move away from criticizing government. If we aren't able, I know y'all are silent in here, I'm a preacher, I'm not a politician. If we are silent, truly we must all hold ourselves together and our agencies accountable for being fully engaged in the community alongside the government. Myself, Councilwoman Porter, Delegate Simmons, Pastor Billy have held Monzi accountable for being there and stabilizing our community, and they have done just that. And I want to applaud Monzi for that, if you can give them a hand for me. And now we know that we still have a lot to do, but I just want to take this opportunity just to say thank you. Can you just give another applause, please? Now, that being said, this is our opportunity to engage in open and constructive dialogue and to support one another as we examine the events that have transpired and how to ensure they never happen again. You can find a copy of the agenda for the meeting on the tables in front of you. And when it's time for questions and answers or Q&A, we'll encourage everyone to participate, ask questions, share your concerns, and most importantly, listen to your fellow community members. But before we get started, we just want to go over some house rules that will guide the meeting tonight. These are to ensure that we are able to hear from the residents, possible tonight, and are able to have a productive conversation. So this is what we ask you to do. We ask you to stay respectful of your neighbors who are joining us tonight. Please silence your phones and limit side conversations so that everyone can be heard speaking. There are members of the media here tonight, but we ask the media to respect our privacy by not filming or recording inside the cafeteria. We have asked this in order to ensure that everyone tonight is able to feel comfortable making their voices heard without worrying about being the focal points of tonight's meetings or evening news, to ensure we respect everyone's privacy. We ask residents to extend the same courtesy by not filming or recording other residents without their permission. If you want a story told on the news, you are welcome to let a member of the media know and step out into the hallway to discuss with them. But we want to keep this room and this meeting a safe space for everyone to participate and to be heard. You will see that there is one camera. I think I see two, but there should be one, but there's two. And the cameras are simulcastly simulcasting the meeting to the school library down the hallway. In the event that this room fills up, the library will serve as an overflow room so that community members can join us later and that we can watch the meeting from that room. Lastly, if there's a neighbor from other parts of the city here tonight, welcome to Brooklyn. But we want you to understand tonight's meeting is to go over a question and answering space for our community. So my final words. So with all that being said, thank you for your patience as we review the ground rules for tonight's meetings. I now like to turn the floor over to one of the greatest men of God, one of the greatest men, and a man that I do support, none other than this great voice in Baltimore City, Mayor Brandon Scott. Let's applaud him.
Thank you, Pastor Watts. Good evening, and thank you for that introduction. Thank you, everybody. I am so pleased to be back in Brooklyn with you all. As you know, we are here tonight to take an important step in addressing the shortfalls of city government and our counterparts like HABC before and during the horrific mass shooting that your neighborhood endured on July 2nd. Last week, we officially released a combined after-action report that examines what each agency either did or, more importantly, did not do that day. That very night, when I arrived on scene, I started having conversations with City Administrator Leach and Commissioner Worley that I demanded a detailed, unabashed, unbiased accounting of what led to the mass shooting and how we responded to it. As the events of that night and following days unfolded, it became crystal clear that that account should be inclusive of every city agency who played a role. I wanted to make sure that the assessment would be comprehensive and uncompromising, utilizing best practices that have been developed from other mass shooting events like those that occurred in Las Vegas and in Orlando. And that is what I feel we have with the document that we released last week. Tonight, however, I wanted to bring together the leaders and representatives of these agencies who put these action reports together to present some of their key findings and recommendations and hear from you all, those who were the first and most directly impacted of this event. Of course, as you heard, we have Acting Commissioner Worley, Housing CEO Janet Abrams, and of course, as you all know him very well, Mark Mason from Muncie. After you hear from each of them, we want to have an open dialogue with you, provide the opportunity for all of you to ask questions and discuss everything included here with all of you. But as we go through the discussion And before you leave tonight, we want you to have the opportunity to complete the worksheet that should be on the table in front of you. If you don't have one, let us know. We'll get one to you. And we're hoping that your responses on that worksheet tonight will be part of the foundation for drafting a community compact. Staff from our offices will be on hand to collect them as everyone heads out at the end of the meeting, because we're going to outline how we're going to move forward with the police, HABC, the community, and every agency together. And before I turn it over to Acting Commissioner Worley, I really want to take a moment to set the stage for how we're approaching this conversation. The mass shooting that occurred just down the street is one of the most painful chapters in Baltimore's history. We lost the lives of two young people in Aaliyah and Khalees, who should be going about their lives and pursuing their dreams and growing into their best selves. Instead, their families joined the dozens of others, and I'm sure many of you here tonight who are dealing with the trauma of this event and the devastating impact that it continues to have. Tonight, the focus will be on the actions of city government and the agency represented here tonight, and rightly so. But I want you to know that we have never stopped pursuing justice for you, for Aaliyah, for Khalees, and the 28 others who were injured in Brooklyn, and for Baltimore as a whole. There were individuals who made that decision to cowardly, recklessly pull the trigger that night without any regard for human life or anything related to Brooklyn Day, and we will not rest until we hold them accountable. We've made, as you know, 4 arrests so far, but the investigation is not and never will slow down until we bring everybody in, because accountability is where my focus is. Accountability for those who committed the crime, for those police and otherwise who showed up and may have shown indifference in the hours leading up to this mass shooting. Accountability for anybody in city government that made missteps, and then taking action with all of you to ensure that this never happens again. So tonight, we come together to continue our path to accountability and to progress. I'm grateful for every single one of you who chose to be here tonight, because we cannot make these steps forward without you, your input, your commitment to helping us build a better Baltimore. We know we've been in Brooklyn since that night. We're going to continue to be here. But when we're here and hearing from not just what I see when I'm here and visiting and talking with folks, but what Mark and all the team members say is that we have a neighborhood that is deeply engaged and want to be a part of the solution. So to that, I say thank you to each and every one of you, and I'll turn it over to Commissioner Worley.
Good evening. Thank you, Mayor Scott. Within 24 hours of the tragedy, we tasked our Compliance Bureau, who is overseen by the Department of Justice and part of our consent decree to keep us in line with the parameters and the paragraphs of the consent decree. We wanted them to launch an investigation to find out exactly what happened and why. We know we made mistakes. We know we could have done much better that day, and I wanted to know why and how we're going to fix it. It was important that the after action not only showed what we did wrong, but told us how to fix it, how to improve it, so that we make sure that this never happens again. We must ensure better responses. We have to strengthen our community relationships. We have to walk foot. We have to get out of the car. We have to engage the community, because had we done that ahead of time, this may not have happened. So we have to fix that again so we never have it happen again. After the shooting, we did recover some video of some of our officers who acted greatly and heroically afterwards, saving a couple lives who had been shot. Prior to that, we had plenty of chances to intervene and change the outcome, and those who didn't will be held accountable. This report is just the very first step. Like I said, it's done by the Compliance Bureau, so what happens with it now, and I'll go through as I go through the slides. The Compliance Bureau investigates it, gives all the findings over to our Internal Affairs Department, who now looks into the actions of the officers. But before I go into the presentation, I just want to say BPD can and will do better in the future. Very first slide, it just basically says the after action, and it's a summary of our after action report, because mainly, if you saw it, it's about a 90-page document, but these are going to be the highlights. And if we go to the next slide. This goes to the first 4 calls that we got in Brooklyn. Well, the first 4 incidents in Brooklyn Day. On July 28th, our open source unit, who's tasked with going through all of our social media outlets to see if there are any special events that we're missing, any special events that our officers don't know about. A flyer popped up about Brooklyn Day, but it was quickly removed and disappeared, and they weren't able to find it again. But it did say Brooklyn Day Saturday. This was on a Thursday, I believe. So after that, what happened, they were able to search more. They couldn't find anything. On the day of the event, setup started at 7 a.m. So we had officers in Brooklyn throughout the day. So there is also presence at the scene between 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. So all during the day, we had officers who saw Brooklyn Day was happening and basically didn't escalate it up to the chain of command. At 6:57, we received our first 911 call for a disorderly incident in Brooklyn incident. The caller informed dispatch that Brooklyn Day was happening, but the information was never relayed to the officer over the radio. If he had his workstation, he could have seen it, but we don't know if the officer actually saw it on his or acknowledged on his computer. Next slide. Next slide goes to a little further into the timeline. At 9:41, BPD received a 911 call that there are hundreds of males and females armed with guns and knives. An officer says on the radio, we might have to redirect that call to the National Guard, which is actually just unacceptable to say something like that. But I also was not in the officer's mind. And I don't know if he was scared. I don't know what he was doing, if he was asking for more help. But obviously, more help was not asked for at this time either. At 10:37, Foxtrot, which is our helicopter, flew over the party and informed commanders that there was fireworks being discharged and that everything appeared normal. At 12:01, the Southern District commanders alerted Unit 41. Unit 41 is our citywide major who was overseeing the entire city that night, informed them that Brooklyn Day surprised them with their event and that no additional resources were needed. At 12:32, we started getting calls for the shooting. We got 26 different calls for 911. Next slide. What we did here is that we wanted to take a deep dive into Brooklyn, and we're going to do this throughout the city to see if there were any inequities as far as policing, enforcement, whatever we have. And we have an equity officer who's here tonight, one of the few departments that has an equity officer, and we want to see if there's something that we did or didn't do in Brooklyn that could have led to this. So the equity officers was involved the entire time in this after-action report, and he comes up with a few conclusions that we'll come up with recommendations. But they did their part in helping with the findings. What we did find is that the post officer, who was one officer who was responsible for Brooklyn Homes, had more calls in 1 year than any other post in the city except for one. So it was 17% of the call, almost 18% of the calls in the whole Southern District were in Brooklyn Homes. Prior to redistricting, there was only one officer there, but on July the 9th, we redistrict, and part of the redistricting was done so that we would get rid of some of these inequities. We hadn't redistricted for over 60 years, so we were still using post boundaries and neighborhood boundaries from 60 years ago. So with the redistricting, you got 3 postcards now that cover Brooklyn Homes. So it tripled the amount of officers who will be, and that's just for the post officers. That's the ones that are in the cars answering the 911 calls. But that doesn't even include the district action teams or other resources that we send from other parts of the city. Next slide. The equity officer did find the possibility of officer indifference in the planning and response to Brooklyn Day. And I agree with that. We could have been in the neighborhood asking people, hey, when's Brooklyn Day? We knew it was going to happen. It's happened for 27 years. It was going to happen in 2023. So we could have been in there asking, when was Brooklyn Day? We could have been walking foot in Brooklyn Homes, just like if any of you saw coming in today, there's plenty of officers out walking foot. And I'm happy with that, but I want to see that they're out walking foot tomorrow and the next day as well. So it's not just a one-day show. We want to keep doing that, keep doing it in Brooklyn Homes. Staffing shortages could attribute it to the Southern's inability to develop informal community relationships, and it could And we have to look at that a little bit more. We are down 500 officers, but that's not an excuse. We're down officers. We've been down officers for years, so that's not an excuse. Southern District commanders and the neighborhood coordination officers, we relied too heavily on social media. Instead of putting boots on the ground and walking through the neighborhood trying to talk and trying to figure out what was happening, we relied on social media to tell us when Brooklyn Day was happening. And obviously, if we only had one flyer that disappeared pretty quickly, there was an effort for flyers not to appear, which is fine because we find things out all the time from neighbors to community members. But we lack continuity of planning for Brooklyn Day as well. 2022, we had a robust deployment, and Brooklyn Day went off without a problem. Those plans should have been passed on to the new commander. They weren't. Those things will be changed as we move forward when we change commands, because the commander of the Southern from last year retired and the new commander came in. Next slide. These maps here show the inequity of basically enforcement. You see where Brooklyn Homes is down there at the right-hand side on the second map on your right. Very little enforcement as opposed to the rest of Patapsco Avenue, which you see up there where most of the dark blue is. The one on the left that shows the light, those are your calls for service. So you see it's basically we've got more calls for service and less enforcement, less officer presence in there. And then next slide. Next slide goes to staffing, and this is one of the things that I'm basically going to say was not true at all, and certain other entities put this out. Staffing was not an issue on the day of Brooklyn Day. All three of our shifts went out with the full complement of officers they were supposed to have. During the night, because of staffing, because of overtime rules and drafting rules, the Charlie shift, which was the shift that was working 3 to 11, lost a few officers during the night. But even at 10 o'clock, they had 14 officers and 3 sergeants and a lieutenant that was still working the city. So they didn't start the shift short. They end the shift short. And midnight came on fully staffed at 11 o'clock. Next slide. Through the course of the after action, we learned that there were I knew this the night of the incident, there were several dozens of officers throughout the city that could have been deployed to Brooklyn Day had we needed. We could have done them, we could have brought them in during the day, we could have brought them in at night, we could have brought them in any time before the shooting happened and possibly changed the events. We don't know if it would have, but if the cops are there, we don't know, but they weren't there, so we're never going to be able to know. Shift commanders of the Southern Districts, Southern District, and that was basically a sergeant acting as a lieutenant. At 11 o'clock, with a crowd of 800 or 900 people, released all the officers from Charlie shift where we could have held them, kept the whole shift over, had another whole shift on Adam's shift. And then instead of requesting additional officers, they just said no. They tried to rely on overtime, which if you were working the Charlie shift, they didn't work. No one worked overtime that night. It went into the midnight shift, and midnight shift came out with Brooklyn Day basically happening within an hour, a little more than an hour of their shift. Next slide. I went into this a little bit that our intel unit didn't adequately capture or identify social media postings about Brooklyn Day. And on Saturday the 1st, which is most of the day that it occurred, we basically didn't have anybody monitoring it, which has since been changed. Somebody should be in there every single day, especially on a weekend when we know events are happening, because we could have possibly come up with the flyer ahead of time. And it's something else that we had to change. So, hold on a second, my iPad went a little crazy. With the crowd size, the entire shift basically should have been held over, and we should not have had to worry about extra resources, but we did have them available. Once the intel unit saw that one post referencing Brooklyn Day, there was no follow-up from the district to see when Brooklyn Day was occurring. It was basically a couple officers' word of mouth. As soon as that came into fruition, we should have been jumping up and down to try to find out if Brooklyn Day was going to occur on that Saturday. During the night, shift commanders failed to adequately inspect deployments because they should have seen Brooklyn Day. Basically, if you were around, there were cars parked all over the place. There was no way for you not to come in and come out of there to not know something large was happening. Next slide. And this is probably the most troubling for me is Southern District officers and supervisors didn't send information up the chain to the major or captain all during the day as events were happening. It was little consideration for the potential of public safety. 800 or 900 people, even if the whole shift was there, they weren't going to be able to handle that crowd. We needed extra resources. We'd have needed to bring in, we had over 100 cops at one point on the Charlie shift that were working throughout the city that we could have moved at least 30 or 40 of them to Brooklyn Day and to Brooklyn to try to quash any issues. Officers should have been stationed. As soon as we found out that it was Brooklyn Day, officers should have been stationed on the perimeter monitoring things as other resources were coming. That wasn't done. Next slide. You'll see these are some photos of what we captured. Our body-worn cameras, our CCTV was being monitored during the day. That's monitored by a totally separate unit. That was never escalated up to their command to talk about Brooklyn Day, which you can see. It's been set up starting at 7 o'clock. We know tables started getting set up, and then it escalates to the bottom left-hand portion of it. Next slide. We had we had civilians in our City Watch unit who were actually monitoring the cameras by hand. We can track the movement of the cameras that they were actually looking at the crowds. At some point, they did notify the sergeants in charge in the Southern, but again, that was never escalated up to the major or captain. About 10:15 p.m., City Watch personnel made an announcement over the radio that there was a large crowd, a large-scale Brooklyn Day event. There was a few officers and supervisors on Charlie shift who failed to turn their cameras on the entire day. They basically are required to turn their cameras on anytime they interact with a community member. So those things will be turned over to internal affairs. Once officers arrived on the scene for calls for the shootings, officers did adhere to the training and life-saving measures. There's one video that an officer actually working with the community helped save the life of a young man who we put in the car. He put 2 bandages on a chest wound and went through and through, got him to the hospital and actually saved a young man's life. He was a midnight shift officer. Next slide. Actually, you already beat me there. The recommendations. All right, recommendation number 1 is basically pretty much the integrity of the post. Basically, instead of 1 post, there's now 3, so there's 3 officers in there. Those 3 cars always have to be full. Those 3 officers should be staying in the Brooklyn area. I saw a lot of officers today, and I'm going to continue to come through here. I used to live in Brooklyn, so I'm very familiar with Brooklyn homes. So I'm going to continue to come through here to make sure we have our presence and that the presence doesn't go anywhere. Number 2 is further enhance recruitment efforts. Those are things that we can do, but the more cops we have, the more free time they have, the more foot patrol they can walk. And that's what I'm going to push if I get into office, to enforce more foot patrols, getting out of the car, and community engagement. Our community policing plan is probably the only part of the consent decree that we're not ahead of schedule. And my first action is to get us back up to par and to get us ahead of schedule by making that a priority. Next is develop a comprehensive protocol for district intelligence. So when one district commander leaves, there should be a whole book that they have. When I was a commander, we had a whole book for every neighborhood, all the major events that happened, so that the next commander that came in had that information. We didn't do that. That has to come back. Update our police communications channel and ensure intelligence for commanders in a timely manner. Next slide. We already corrected the intelligence units are on a regular schedule, so they work on weekends, and they continue to monitor the social media. Number 6 is update our SOPs on how officers and supervisors should interact and engage when handling large-scale events. This event should have been escalated up the chain of command as soon as we knew it was happening so that we could have gathered up resources and brought them over there, not to shut the party down because we didn't shut it down last year. We monitored it, let the party continue, and the party happened and no incidents last year. And that could have been this year had we been over there and at least monitored it. Review our training policies and protocols for evidence and crime scene management. This is ultimately basically a better communication between our forensic units and our operations unit. If you saw the scene, it was an extremely large scene. It looked like sort of like the infield of Preakness after Preakness was over with all the trash and debris in there, along with all the ballistics evidence that we had to recover. Each district should develop a neighborhood summary. That's what I had talked about before, a neighborhood summary for the commander who's coming in, the outgoing commander and the ingoing commander, which we did that this time. The new major is going to, when Major Hood comes back, the new major and he will sit down and go over a lot of the things that he and the captain haven't gone over yet. Number 9 is conduct periodic exercises that follow up best practices. We can do tabletops, but these should all be done not in a silo of police. It should be done with the community. It should be done in the community. We do that all the time for large-scale events. There's no reason we can't do it in the community with community members who want us there to help. Prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion training for all commanders, and refresher courses. They've gotten some training, and we're going to continue to do that. Number 11, which has already happened, a lot of these cases have been turned over to the Public Integrity Bureau. Unfortunately, some of our members have already been charged with offenses in reference to this, and our Public Integrity Bureau will investigate it, and they will receive, if they're found guilty, they'll receive the punishment. And basically, that takes about 30 to 90 days for them to complete the investigation, depends on how elaborate it is and how much body-worn camera they have to look at. But our members who did this, the Compliance Bureau looked at hundreds of hours of body-worn camera. We did not interview any officers for this or any supervisors, mainly because we didn't want to compromise the internal affairs investigations. That's who will interview the officers and supervisors as to their actions that night. So thank you, and now I'll turn it over to Chief Abrahams of Housing Authority.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Janet Abrahams. I am the President and CEO of the Housing Authority of Baltimore City, and I do want to welcome everyone this evening and thank you for coming out. First and foremost, I want our hearts and prayers go out to the families that were impacted by this mass shooting, but also the entire community of Brooklyn Homes. I want you to know that you are not in this alone. We are here as a team to ensure that we help you through this process. While everyone has had a lot to say, I do think I need to talk about the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that everyone says HABC should have known. You're correct. We're underground. We work with the families every single day. But unfortunately, the trust just wasn't there. We were not notified. The agency, I can honestly say, I learned about this issue, this mass shooting, at 3 a.m. in the morning. At the time when I was notified, everyone on my emergency alert was contacted, and everyone was awake immediately to ensure that we're underground and we're doing exactly what we said we would do in our emergency preparedness plan. Our Resident Services Department was one of the first group on site, knocking on doors, checking on families to ensure that the families were okay. Our maintenance team was on site when they were approved to get on site to help to make sure that we clear the debris and work with the police so that our families can go about their business, because we also need to understand this is a family community and families live there that have things to do during the day, and they were not stopping that process. So we had to make sure our children were not traumatized over and over again as they enter in and out of their unit. We continue to work with our families. We continue to work with our tenant association to ensure that we're doing everything we possibly can to strengthen our organization, but also to work with the management team to ensure that we have better communications. We did a deep dive into all the things that we found on the ground, and our findings are as such. Sorry, if you bear with me 1 second. So upon notification of the mass shooting, we followed our routine emergency response, coordinated with the city agencies and our providers. We believe that a more efficient coordination process among all agencies involved could have been realized and established in a joint information center. And what does that mean? It means that for those of you who live in our properties, HABC continues to provide every single service that the city provides, but on a smaller scale. So when you have a mass shooting such as this, which is the first that ever happened in our community, we had to learn to play nice. And we had to learn how to make sure that we allow other agencies into our community that we are very protective of, and make sure that we have the right systems in place so that we can work as individuals, but also as a team. It was vital that we do that. And so that's one of the things in our recommendations that I will talk about, how we will strengthen that process. We realized that the requirement for prior approval for indoor and outdoor events defined in our lease was not included in our continued admissions and occupancy policy. For those of you who live in our community, you realize that we have a lease, a very extensive lease, that lists out a lot of the information that we use to govern how we manage the property, how we interact with our residents. But how we interact with the properties and how we administer our program is done through our continued and occupancy policy. There were some misalignment with both documents. We did not address the lease, but we did align the ACOP with the lease. And I do think that, again, that's another elephant in the room, because one of the things that we talked about in the beginning that was some misunderstanding, HABC is not in the business of evicting families. However, we must maintain our properties based on the documents that govern how we manage and how we get our funding. We are fully funded by HUD, and we follow those protocols. So when we realize that there are things that's happening in our property, we have no choice but to go back to those documents, because that is how we're governed. There are no gray areas, ladies and gentlemen. It's very black and white. And we have no choice but to make sure that we're following those to the letter. We also realize that there needs to be more coordinated efforts on a larger scale for all events, especially consistent with the city's permitting process. I'm not sure that if you all are aware, but HABC did not, anyone who have any type of activities on HABC's property, we did not go through the permitting process through the city. The permitting process is a very extensive process, and what it does, it taps into every single one of these city services. So in case you're having a party such as the mass party that happened at Brooklyn Homes, all the right departments would be notified, i.e. the police department, the fire department, simply because there were road closure, and we had to ensure that emergency vehicles can get in and out. So these are some of the things that would help with the permitting process as we continue to coordinate with the city to make sure that we're all part of their process. So from a recommendation standpoint, one of the things that I do want to bring to everyone's attention was that the Housing Authority have an 800 number. Each property have a distinctive 800 number that represents their site. No one called that 800 number during this incident. Is it partly our fault? Yeah. You know why? Because it talks about fire, flood, or blood, call 911. We, as a housing authority, we cannot, of course, respond to fire. We can't respond to a lot of things because we're a housing authority. We're bricks and mortar, and we have some social programs involved. So one of the things that we intend to do with this 800 number is to start with working with our communications department to get the word out to every one of our residents, not just at Brooklyn Homes, but everywhere, so that moving forward, whenever any incidents happen on the site, that they can use this 800 number to alert us. We respond to the 800 number. In some cases, when we have big emergencies, we have an alert media system, and that alert media system alerts me on my phone to let me know there's a big issue going on in the property, i.e. when we have power outages, especially in Cherry Hill. So we will make sure moving forward that this number is utilized for everything, not just for a stopped up toilet or no electricity or what have you. So that is a campaign that we are putting forward immediately for those residents in the room, not just at Brooklyn Homes, but for all our residents. They will start seeing communications that really talk about these 800 numbers. Prior to the Brooklyn incident, we also entered into contracts with private armed security services at other sites that we piloted to see, number one, how much it will cost to implement this across the entire agency, but also how the deployment process would work and how we would work cohesively with the police department. As of August 1st, Brooklyn Homes do have a private security, armed security firm that's working 2 shifts on site. That is something that we will continue, that we've made promises and we will continue to do that. I talked about the emergency number. We will also engage with so one of the things that I can never forget, I am responsible for the residents of the housing authority, but I'm also responsible for the employees. And in order for our employees to implement and to react in the manner in which we expect them to, we have to provide the necessary training and make sure our documents reflects our expectations. So we have engaged a third party to work with the housing authority to ensure that our emergency preparedness plan is updated and covers mass shootings. We do have an emergency preparedness plan, but this particular situation was never mentioned, but we did a good job because we did what we knew. We were fixing the plane while we were flying it, and we did the best that we could while we were on site. We will also convene tabletop exercises with the staff to ensure that we're responding accordingly and timely. We're also working with our staff as far as the indoor-outdoor activities. We have already worked with our board to get the permission to update our ACOP that has been completed. We're working diligently with our legal department to ensure that we update all our policies and procedures moving forward so that anyone who intends to have an event on HABC site will sign the proper documentation and also follow the proper protocols. We're also collaborating with the city to establish a permitting process for HABC site. And the reason why we're doing that, of course, we're working very hard with the city to work through some of the logistics, work through payment, work through how notifications will be done. It is a massive process, but we're doing, I want to thank Monica and her team for doing a yeoman's job of really coordinating it and making sure that at the end of the day, it is not onerous on the staff and it is not onerous on the residents once we implement this process. Next slide. So I just want to give you a quick check of all the things that we have completed to date. Of course, we have completed the safety and security portion of our findings. The security guards are currently, as I mentioned, on site, and they're across the agency. We have updated the guidelines that I mentioned, which is the ACOP to match the lease. And we will be conducting trainings across the agency so that our residents will understand what are the protocols to holding events on HABC's property. $800? HABC will engage a third party to review our emergency response efforts and make recommendations to support more effective and efficient collaboration. And also, the emergency after-hour numbers, as I talked about, that we're getting ready to launch a campaign. And HABC is collaborating with the city, as I mentioned, about the permitting process. So those are the things that we're implementing. There are other things that we're doing that's a little bit more detailed. As we go through and work with the families and start going through the reports, we will be back working with our families to ensure that we talk about all the different things. And of course, on our properties with our management team, our resident services, we're really working hard to make sure that we create that trust, that we rebuild the trust in the site so that we are notified in advance of any type of activity that is unsanctioned by the Housing Authority. Thank you.
I guess we're inviting all the residents, huh? Everybody, no resident left behind. Yeah. Yes, indeed. Good evening, everyone. For those of you all who don't know who I am, I'm Mark Mason, Associate Director of Victim Services for the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. I would like to first thank Mayor Scott, Madam CAO Leach, and Councilwoman Porter for immediately initiating the stabilization for the residents of Brooklyn Homes. As some of you all may know, Brooklyn has a very special place in my heart, as I used to be a teacher and assistant principal here, collectively for about 15 years in the community, and proud to say that I have considered this a second home, which leads me to say that it has been truly an honor recently serving the community, even though it has been under these circumstances. This stabilization has given us in city government the opportunity to be true public servants to a really great community. With some of the things that have come out of Monty being here, such as our current bi-weekly stakeholder meetings, as well as the relationships formed with individuals like Pastor Watts, Pastor Billy, Delegate Simmons, and other community members, and especially the current residents. Our goal is to work to continue to strengthen Brooklyn to be a safe and blossoming place to live. Thank you. MONSI is the agency responsible for the implementation of Baltimore's first ever comprehensive violence prevention plan, and our work covers 3 interconnected direct service lanes: gun violence prevention, including the group violence reduction strategy and community violence intervention, victim services, and community engagement and opportunity, including coordinated neighborhood stabilization response, reentry, and youth diversion. Our focus has been on immediately mobilizing resources in partnership with stakeholders like the individuals I named before, Pastor Watts, Pastor Billy Humphrey, and the Brooklyn Homes Tenant Council, to help stabilize the community and address trauma in the aftermath of the July 2nd incident. We understand that what took place on Brooklyn Day has deeply impacted this community, and that for decades, our residents in South Baltimore have felt neglected by their city government, which is why we've made it our mission to show up for this community and for everyone who has been directly or indirectly victimized by the mass shooting. Over the past 2 months, the agency has taken time to assess the results, outcomes, and impacts of our coordinated neighborhood stabilization response activation led by Rick Leandri, a constantly evolving process which here in Brooklyn has lasted more than 60 days and is gradually continuing. Internal, interagency, and community coordination and collaboration, and internal and external communications. MONSI's After Action Report is the culmination of this internal assessment and feedback we have gotten from residents and other stakeholders. It covers our initial CNSR activation, where we mobilized over 60 partners to provide direct services out of the community center with a focus on on-site therapeutic and mental health services, coordinated victim services, and trauma-responsive care. The second phase of our CNSR, where we began focusing on community-identified priorities, such as the need for support specifically tailored to young people and access to fresh produce, to address what we call the root environmental factors that produce and reproduce cycles of violence in our communities. For victim services, we provided on-site coordinated victim service supports with staff at Monsey, State's Attorney's Office, and BPD working in close partnership to meet the immediate and ongoing needs of primary and secondary victims impacted by the Brooklyn Homes mass shooting. And last but not least, violence intervention work both at Brooklyn Day prior to the mass shooting and in the weeks after the incident, including mediations done by Safe Street staff at Brooklyn Day and efforts by the Safe Streets Brooklyn site to help stabilize the community. Based on the findings of our internal assessment and conversations with community stakeholders, we've developed a comprehensive set of recommendations to improve our CNSR and victim services processes and enhance information sharing so that we're doing our part to improve public safety outcomes for all Baltimoreans, regardless of zip code, race, or socioeconomic status. Some of our recommendations. In our extensive review of our response here in Brooklyn, we found that there were things that our team executed well, as well as some room for improvement. In total, our after-action report outlined 9 unique sets of findings and recommendations, but this evening, I'll share a few of our top-line recommendations. For Safe Streets, in our evaluation, we found that there are only informal practices, no documented protocols regarding when and how Safe Streets staff share knowledge with Monsey CVI staff about large events or potential emerging threats to public safety in their catchment zones. For this, we recommend updating CVI standard operations manuals to expand the criteria for when Safe Streets staff escalate information about potential incidents to Monsey CVI staff. In our evaluation, we found that the scrutiny of Safe Streets' response to the incident made it apparent that there is some public confusion about Safe Streets Baltimore's role and its model. For this, we recommend increasing public communication and awareness about the daily work of Safe Streets Baltimore, what their evidence-based street outreach model looks like, and how they function as credible messengers with those at highest risk. In addition, a recommendation about how to facilitate increased engagement between Safe Street sites and key community stakeholders. For mobilization and wraparound supports, in our evaluation, we found that coordinated neighborhood stabilization responses are constantly evolving activations that require the coordination of multiple interagency, cross-governmental, and community-based partners to address residents' needs throughout the process. This work is relatively new to the city, being first piloted by Monsey in 2022, and a CNSR has never been deployed for an incident of the magnitude of the July 2nd mass shooting. For this, we recommend updating the CNSR process map to ensure that protocols are consistent, fully developed, and up to date. Also, establishing a joint information center for future CNSR activations to streamline communication channels across stakeholders. In addition, ensuring dates and commitments are locked down and promoted to community stakeholders and residents at least 48 hours in advance. In addition, for mobilization, wraparound supports, and coordination continued, in our evaluation, we found that over the course of the Brooklyn Homes CNSR, 167 residents signed in at the community center and expressed the need. Of the 98 requests for relocation and/or housing assistance tracked by Monsey, 86 were residents of Brooklyn Homes. To date, Monsey is providing some level of case management support to 19 victims, both primary and secondary, of the Brooklyn Homes mass shooting, which with needs ranging from relocation assistance, ongoing mental health supports, assistance with criminal injuries compensation, rental assistance, and other services. For this, we recommend building out an internal central information hub and database for resources and offers of assistance from external partners to limit service redundancy and ensure resident needs are more effectively met. Working in partnership with BPD and State's Attorney's Office Victim Services to develop an interagency process map and regular coordinated case review meeting. Some of this work has already begun and should be institutionalized. Recommendations to also continue to actively work with partners to assess and process the remaining requests for support have been discussed as well. We're not just going to drop in and parachute out like many people thought. As part of our post-CNSR work, we want to make sure that we're continuing to maintain a presence in the community and are working with local organizations, faith leaders, and other partners to help meet residents' needs. Marzi has currently been in the Brooklyn community for well past 60 days, and we are continuing efforts to be a part of the continued stabilization. Marzi Victim Services is actively working with our partners to assess and process outstanding requests for support. In addition to the calendar of events listed on this slide, we will be working with our partners to hold events specifically tailored to the needs of older adults and the broader community throughout the fall. Most importantly, this Saturday, we're bringing together our community partners and mobilizing resources on the basketball court behind the Brooklyn Homes Community Center from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. We will have supports available from Councilwoman Porter's office, Rec and Parks, the Health Department, City of Refuge, Kingdom Life Church, DPW, Department of Social Services, MVA, House of Ruth, DHCD, Moms Demand Action, Safe Streets Baltimore, St. Vincent de Paul, Early Head Start, the Mayor's Office of Employment Development, Ideal Options Substance Abuse, Turk House, and more. As the mayor said, we welcome your feedback as we push ourselves to improve every single aspect of our portfolio and work in partnership to build better, safer communities throughout Baltimore. Our team looks forward to answering any and all questions that you all may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. Please be sure to leave your worksheets. We will pick them up. And as you know, we're going to continue to be here to support Brooklyn.